Last week I showed you the easiest way to define colors, HSB. Works not only in Photoshop but other design apps as well. This week we'll get practical so you can describe the exact color you want every time. All right, so the easiest way to define color inside Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign, insofar as I'm concerned, is HSB. And so here it is inside the color picker. If you were to bring up the color picker dialog box in any of 20,000 different ways inside Photoshop, then HSB is right there at the outset. The easiest way to work, however, I think, is here inside the color panel. If you have it open on screen, click on a hamburger and choose color wheel, like so. And there is your color wheel. If you want to make it bigger, just drag the bottom edge like so, and you'll see the HSB values along with the hue wheel around the outside. And then we have this triangle that's trying to represent saturation and brightness. Saturation horizontally, so we're going from drab to intense color horizontally, and then brightness from black to white vertically. That's not strictly how HSB works, however, so we're not really going to be focusing too much on that triangle, if at all. Let's just say not at all. Now let's take a look at the hue wheel, which is central to understanding hue and color in general when you're working inside Photoshop. And so what I'm going to do is press the I key to get the eyedropper, and I'll click right there. I want you to take a look at the hue value in the top right corner of the screen. So sort of keep your eye, at least glancing up here every once in a while. Notice that the hue value H is 0 degrees, which is red. I think that's pretty clear. Saturation and brightness are both maxed out to 100%. And then as I drag around, so the wheel is divided into 360 degrees because it's a circle after all, and it starts at 0 degrees over here on the right hand side. Then if you continue dragging around, see that hue value in the top right corner of the screen, it's going to increase through the oranges, then through the yellows, and then through the greens, and so on all the way around. And here we are, increasing this value. So counterclockwise increases the value. I'm at 356 degrees, 357, 8, 9, and then all of a sudden, once we get to 359, if I go a little further, we're going to reset to 0 degrees because 360 degrees for a full circle is the same as 0 degrees. And then it continues around once again. Now, if we were to add saturation to the center of this wheel, we're going to end up seeing the color wheel. And that's because we're reducing the saturation values as we go toward the center, assuming a brightness value of 100%, as we're seeing. Actually, I'm seeing a brightness value of 93, but let's say I click in the center here. There it is. Oh, there it is at 100%. Then if I have no saturation, let's see if I can get that saturation value down to 0 degrees. Well, 1 degree seems to be as low as I'm going to get here, but that is equivalent to white. So the lower you go with the saturation value, assuming that the brightness value is cranked up to 100%, the more you're going to get white. And so if you want gray, then you're going to have to reduce the brightness value like so. And notice there we have a 50% gray. Doesn't matter what the hue value is set to because we have no saturation. In any event, that's when you add hue and saturation, you get color, and I just want you to see what the color wheel looks like. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to add brightness. And brightness is on a different axis, right? So right now, we're seeing two axes together, and that gives us a 2D circle. So we're seeing hue around the outside and saturation toward the inside. If we want to see brightness as well, then we need to project this wheel into 3 dimensions, and that gives us a cone. And that's because when you're reducing the saturation, you've got all the room in the world to work with. You have all kinds of values, lots of distinct colors, as we can see. But when you start reducing the brightness value, you go toward black. And so we have a 3-dimensional diagram of everything there is associated with HSB, and it is indeed a perfect cone, which makes it a really easy way to work, even if it doesn't match the way we perceive color. And so let's start diving into that. I'm going to add some color names. This is where we left off in the last video, in the previous video, is with these colors right here, red, orange, and yellow. Notice how tightly they're packed together. And then we have this big, huge area of green. Then we get cyan, blue, and magenta. These are the primaries, by the way. Red, yellow, and green, cyan, blue, and magenta are the primaries. But we need more than that because we can't just leave out orange. Orange is like responsible for a great deal of the world as we're sensitive to it. Because this is where, right in this range right here, is where all the skin tones are, all the woods. Think of the wood in your house, whether it's a hardwood floor, it's a cabinet, it's a piece of furniture, something like that. It falls in this range right here. So this is the natural world. Sure, there's a lot of green out there as well, but we're only sensitive to this range. And then I've got to add violet between blue and magenta. We can't not have violet right there. And then I decided to add one more color. Right in this range here, I'm adding azure. It is a subjective call. It's what I used to call cobalt for those of you who've watched my videos in the past. But azure is the consensus color that people have agreed on over time. I thought of adding one more color. We already have 9 colors now. I thought of adding another one right about here and calling it crimson, which is something of an industry standard name. But I didn't because I don't want that many color strips. Wait, longish video, right? But it's nothing compared to my full uncut version that includes the color lies we were taught as children, how color begins at violet and ends with red and magenta doesn't even exist, true story, and a few fun facts from none other than Isaac Newton himself. Interested? Then join my Patreon, which is patreon.com/geeknow. And now, back to practical, everyday HSB. What we're going to do is we're going to take those colors and we're going to map them onto a big version of the hue wheel. So brightness and saturation, where every one of these colors are concerned, are cranked up to 100%. Notice that if I click in here, you can see that they're maxed out to 100% here inside the color panel. And so we're just seeing distinctions in hue. And now I'm going to map those colors, those 9 colors, on them once again. Red, orange, yellow, green, huge green, cyan, azure, blue, violet, magenta. And they wrap around into each other. Then what I'm going to do is sort of solve a little bit of a mystery. You may be thinking at this point, well, wait a sec. I learned when I was a kid, I don't think they teach that anymore, but once upon a time they taught the rainbow colors were Roy G. Biv. And that is, by the way, red, orange, and yellow. Totally in agreement with that. G for green, and it's taken up an entire region of the hue wheel, so it makes sense that's the middle initial all by itself of this guy. He's a guy, Roy G. Biv. And then blue, indigo, violet, that doesn't make any sense. Never has. This bugged me since I was a little kid, actually. Indigo is nonsense. Let's just be nice and call it nonsense. It shouldn't be here. It doesn't belong. And what's weird about it is it's on the other side of violet. It's actually where violet, watch the hue value over there. Violet is 270 degrees technically. Indigo is 275. So it's on the other side of violet. And it's not much different than violet, really. It's just kind of a bluish violet color, and yet it's in between blue and violet right there for it. It's not, no, there is no indigo, not in the rainbow, that's for sure. I just want to show you what it should be. It should be Roy G. Cabuvm is how I'm going to pronounce this, like it's a Roman V that could be a U. And that's why I set this text right here in Trajan, so it's all Roman looking. But that does more accurately represent the color. So red, orange, yellow, once again, G gets its own middle name, don't know what it stands for, and then cyan, azure, blue, violet, magenta, running together over here in this bottom left region of the hue wheel. And that is the rainbow of colors. And what I'm going to do is kind of divide things into 15-degree increments. And that's because, after all, this is a 360-degree circle. So 15 degrees, so it goes 15, 0 right there, 15, 30, 45, 60, and so forth. And that gives us 24 increments in total when you divide 360 by 15. And so I just figured, to keep things as simple as possible, we'd go with 15-degree increments. And then I thought what I would do is divide up these color ranges according to the way we actually see them. So assuming that we're all in agreement that these are the colors we see: red, orange, and yellow, and then green, big, huge area of green: cyan, azure, blue, violet, and magenta. You may or may not regularly talk about cyan, but that is an industry standard color term. But the areas, the ranges that those colors consume on the hue wheel are quite different. So notice red is consuming a 30-degree range, starting with 345, 15 degrees to 0, and then another 15 degrees to 15 degrees right there. So this is 30 degrees in all. And then same for orange. If you add 30 to 15, you get 45, so another 30-degree range. What I don't want to imply is somehow red ends right there at 15 degrees and orange starts. That's not the case at all. These are subjective borderlines, let's say. But really, the color between this at 13 degrees and here at, what would this be? 15 degrees is what it's calling for me here. Let's say 16 degrees is not that different, right? This is a continuous color transition as we go around the big hue wheel. So yellow, once again, 60 degrees altogether. Green, so much of green. Notice all of this. We'll see more of this, but notice how little that color that we're seeing at the top above the eyedropper is changing. It's just not changing much at all subjectively, right? It's not changing to our eyes, and that's because this area of the hue wheel does not account for the way that we see color. And so I'm giving it a total of 5 15-degree increments. Notice that: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is a total of 75 degrees compared to 30 degrees. It's more than twice as big as red, orange, or yellow. And then I'm also devoting a big area to cyan, a total of 3 15-degree increments, so 45 degrees, and then back to 30 degrees for azure, blue, violet, and then a big range once again for magenta. I'm giving it 4 15-degree increments. You don't need to remember any of this, but I just want to give you a sense of what's going on. 60 degrees in all, so twice as big as red or orange or yellow, actually as big as red and orange put together. Now, this is where things get extremely subjective. Like you might look at this and say, Deke, you're just plain wrong that magenta could possibly include this much of the color wheel. Things get quite unique, I would say, over in this range right here. Notice this here. Let me eyedrop a color right there for magenta. Notice how kind of purplish that is. And if I then go ahead and eyedrop a color right here, it's very different. Do you look at the bottom, which is the old magenta, and the top, which is the new magenta? Very different looking colors. I toyed with the idea of giving another color name, crimson, to this region, which is something, once again, of an HTML standard, like as I did with Azure, but that would give us 10 colors, and it's just too much to sort of juggle in our minds. I decided. So I made a call, is what I'm saying here. We're just saying that magenta covers everything from here. See how different that is from the bottom colors. They can't possibly, those can't possibly belong in the same color category, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to shoehorn them together for better or for worse. Now, let's talk about the central colors, the fulcrum, if you will, for each one of these color ranges. Red is defined. The industry standard red is defined at 0 degrees. The industry standard yellow is defined at 60 degrees. We can't help but call 30 degrees orange. We just got to add that color in there. Green, because it's so big, I'm making a call that it's 112 degrees, even though the industry standard is 120. So real green is 120 degrees. Let me show you something, though. I'm just going to switch to the rectangular marquee tool for a second. Draw a rectangular marquee like so. And let's fill it with green. I'm going to get my eyedropper for a second here. And you know what? I didn't need to do that. I'm just going to drag around inside the big color, the big hue wheel that's available to us inside the color panel, and see how the hue value is 120 degrees. Saturation and brightness are both 100%. And I'll just fill that area. Actually, I have to create a new layer. I'll press Control-Shift-N. Command-Shift-N on the Mac, and I'll just call this experiments because we're going to be doing some color experiments here and there. And did I spell that right? I did. And I'll just go ahead and fill this guy with foreground color by pressing Option backspace, Alt backspace on the PC, Option delete on the Mac. There we have 120 degrees. All right, now I'm going to press the M key and for the rectangular marquee and draw another one. And I'm going to drag this guy over to 112 degrees. Because after all, that's the call I'm making. Why 112? Because it's midway between the edges of the range. If you take 150 and 75 and you average them, you get 112.5 actually. I'm just even, rounding it to 112. And now I'll fill this with 112 degree green. Look at that. That's 112. So the other was 120. You saw that. Let me zoom in right here. I'm going to get the eyedropper again. I will eyedrop here. See how it's 120. Look in the top right corner of the screen, 120, and then drag down. It's 112. Do you see that? And yet, do you see the border? It's right there. Can you see it? I can't actually see it. I just happen to know it's right there. I would love, look at that. The vertical border, what? Oh, there's 112. You can see it in the top right corner of the screen. There's 120. So 8 degrees different. And yet, you ask me, I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing that on this screen. And this is an HDR display that I'm looking at. And we're working in the image P3 RGB space. For those of you who are curious, we'll see more about that in a moment. But just know it doesn't matter what the RGB space is. I'm not going to see any more of a difference than I'm seeing right now. What I'm saying is, if you're seeing a difference, if you're like going, oh my gosh, Deke, that's as different as yellow and violet. I mean, I can totally see the difference between these colors. You're special. You've got ultra eyes or an ultra brain or something. I'd like to hear from you if you are really seeing the difference here. Let's go to the corner. Can you call the corner? There's 112 degrees and there's 120 degrees. I'm just trying to make a point. I don't see it at all. And that's green for you. It's just not showing things as well. But just, entertain a thought experiment for a moment. Even though you and I have agreed, along with all kinds of color scientists out there, that there's a certain wavelength that we have associated, a light wavelength that we have called yellow. And similarly for violet, that we have called violet. There's no knowing what you in your mind think of as yellow. It could be different. You could see violet where I see yellow. That is actually a possibility. And so it's possible that we see these colors different as well. But anyway, that's green. Green is just a bunch of colors where hue is concerned, a hue value of green, that we don't see much different. The more I look at it, I'm like, yeah, I can kind of see a difference. But I know where it is, so I've been cheating. I know where the border is. Anyway, that's why I'm calling it 112 degrees, because it's in the middle. It makes everything else work. Because cyan is also multiple 15 degrees, I'm calling the center 172 degrees. That's what I'm calling the fulcrum. Real cyan in HSP world is 180 degrees, by the way. That's a little easier to see the difference. If I were to draw... Well, just because I've been doing this, some of you are running out of patience, I'm sure, but I'm just going to drag inside this guy, this hue wheel right here, till I get 180 degrees, and I'll fill that rectangle with it. And now I'll go ahead and draw another one, and I'll drag inside this guy until I get a hue value of 172 degrees, which is what I'm calling it. And then I'll go ahead and fill that guy. That's different. I'm going to zoom in. I'm not claiming you're not going to see a difference between these two. I do. I see a difference between 172 and 180. 172 is slightly greener. So, some of these, you're going to see the difference. But anyway, I am calling that as 172 for cyan because that's midway between 150 and 195, which I'm calling the range. And we'll see what that looks like in more detail in a moment. 30-degree range, so it's 45-degree range for cyan, 30 degrees each for azure, blue, and violet. And then I'm saying a 60-degree range, a pretty big range, for 15-degree increments for magenta. Real magenta is right about here. It's 300 degrees. There it is. Do you see it in the top right corner of the screen? Let's make a rectangle, why don't we, and fill it with that version of magenta. That's HSB magenta right there. Hue, the hue version of magenta. Whereas if I go with 315 degrees, 15 degrees off, 300 for this, 315 is what I'm calling magenta, which is much closer to magenta ink. And it's midway between 285 and 345 right there. If I go ahead and draw another rectangle and fill it, I'll go ahead and drag up like so in the hue wheel over here to 315 degrees. This is going to be way different. Notice that. And now I'll click off so we can see. I don't think there's too many of us, if you're not colorblind, that can't make this out. This would be standard color vision. You can make out the difference between the 315 degree magenta right here and the 300 degree magenta right there. And so that's a big difference. But as I'm saying, the most tenuous of the color ranges that I'm creating here, that I'm calling, is magenta. It just really starts getting into red territory very fast. And, you might want to call this crimson or something along those lines. Anyway, let's now take each one of these. I think that's where I'm at. Let me make sure. Is that? Yes, I am. I'm going to take each one of these areas, and instead of viewing them in the context of a circle, a continuous circle, which makes it a little difficult to, really tell one color from another, let's take those color ranges and project them onto horizontal bars like so. So we have the same colors, red, orange, yellow, and so forth, down to magenta here. And the same color, the degrees, that is, the same color boundaries. So 345 at the far end of red, at the magenta end of red, and then 15 degrees at the orange end, and then 0 degrees right in the center. Now you can see, I would say you can see the distinction as we move along from 345 to 0 to 15. But what I'm trying to do is keep everything equal. Each one of these ranges I want to call as being an equal visual range. Whether I'm right about that or not is again, loosey-goosey. But that is my description of HSB, but so friendly. And then with orange, we're starting at 15, where we ended red. We're starting over here, orange, the red end of orange. Then we've got orange in the middle at 30 degrees, and we have quite a yellow orange by comparison over at 45. But then 45 starts out yellow, right? And it's a very orange yellow, a very almost greenish yellow for the true yellow at 60 degrees, and then chartreuse over here at 75 degrees, and so forth. Notice this huge range for green. That's a 30-degree range for yellow. This is, once again, a 75-degree range. This happens to match 75 degrees right there, but the range from 75 to 150 is 75 degrees. And so we're covering this enormous green territory, and yet the distinctions, like the amount that I'm seeing different for green, for the green bar, and the orange bar, are pretty equivalent, I think, even though one is 30-degree range and this is a 75-degree range. There's 112 at the center of it and moving down. So again, the ones that have artificial centers, that I've monkeyed with the centers, are 112 for green, 172 for cyan, and 315 for magenta. But I have to acknowledge that the range of color that I'm seeing in the magenta bar down here at the bottom is the biggest range. That looks bigger to me than violet, but not that much bigger. Violet is actually covering a huge amount of visual color difference in its 30 degrees. Just maybe more for magenta in its 60-degree range. All right, now let's move on to seeing independent color swatches, because I think once we want to start getting a sense for how to mix HSB, we don't want to be working with gradients, because it's just, there's too little difference between neighboring colors. So we want to see color swatches that are uniquely identifiable, such as 350 degrees. So I'm starting with whatever fulcrum color I've given, which is 0 degrees for red, truly is 10 degrees over for a magenta version of red, and 10 degrees over to the right for an orange version of red. And then I'm jumping another 10 degrees for orange, a very hardy orange over here at 20 degrees. And then 30 degrees is the typical definition of orange, even though it's not a primary color. And then 40 degrees for this very yellowish orange over here. And then we're jumping to 50 degrees, which is your golden orange, or yellow, that is. It's just my favorite of all the hue yellows. It'd be the 45 to 50 degree range. 60 degrees gets too kind of tinny. You know what I mean? It's too green. And then we get chartreuse over here at 70 degrees. Note it now. These are all 10 degree variations so far between each of these swatches. And I think they're clearly distinguishable. Once we get to green, because this is such an enormous range, I'm giving us a lot more range between the swatches. So this is 112 in the center. It's 27 degrees over to 85 degrees here. This is a 27 degree difference, not just 10, 27 now. So almost 3 times the difference. And yet about the same amount as a visual difference. Wouldn't you agree? I don't know. Maybe a little more. And then we get into a bluish, almost turquoise at 140 degrees. And now, and bear in mind that RGBG, so the green of red, green, blue, primary lights of color, primary colors of light is what I meant to say. That's quite, by the way, bright. It's a very bright green, just for what it's worth. And then there's cyan, another big range this time around. So 172 I'm calling it as. And then we're 12 degrees off to get to 160. And then it's another 13 degrees from 172 to 185. So 12, then 13. Again, I'm rounding to get my center color right there. And then we go back to 10 degree increments. I've gotten rid of the color names, but this is Azure right here. So there's your sky blue right there, 210. And we're just getting a little more cyan at 200, quite a bit more blue at 220, and then 230, 240, 250. We're not seeing that much action going on. That's because I squoze in a color for Azure. And so with 230 to 240 is probably, of all the colors we're seeing here, is the smallest difference in terms of how we're seeing them. But it's a 10 degree difference. And then we're seeing, it looks a lot bigger when we get to 250. And then 260, 270, 280 for the range of violets down here. 280 I would call more of a purple. So reddish violet is purple. And then we get down to big differences in the magenta territory, but we are working with 20 degree increments now, from 295 to 315 to 335. Now, some of these differences are so big that I thought I would add color swatches in between them. And I was just going to do the ones that, like, to me, 315 to 335 is a big difference. 270 to 280 is a big difference. Where's another one? 112 to 140 is a big difference, and so forth. But then I thought, well, I should just add color swatches in between all of them. So incremental color swatches. So here we have them. I would say 355 is very different than 350. Whether it's that different from 0, I'm not sure. And then, of course, the difference between 315 and 325 and 335 is quite different indeed. And so, you know, it's going to look different to you is what I'm guessing. But I just want to make this as comprehensive of an admittedly subjective chart as possible. And then I thought, well, we got to wrap around on the right and left-hand sides so that we're not seeing a big difference of 10 to 20 degrees, for example, so far apart from each other as well. So I added colors there. And so these color swatches, the newest ones, they repeat. So between 10 and 15 degrees, that takes us to the end of the red range. And then I repeat 15 degrees at the beginning of the orange range. There's 45 at the end, and 45 once again at the beginning of yellow, and so forth, all the way up and down. 345, as you can see, is quite different than 350 at the beginning of the red range. And it's quite different still between 335 and 345 at the end of the magenta range. So I would say the one that is most suspect, of course, I've made this clear over and over, is magenta. Now, I just know there's somebody out there who's going, wait a second, Deke. Do these HSB values change depending on your profiled RGB space? And the answer is a very definite yes. And so what I'm going to do here is go up to the edit menu and choose assign profile. That's going to bark at me. Very likely you're going to see it too. Photoshop is going to tell you that just changing a profile on the fly is not a great idea, but it actually is in this case. So I'm going to click OK. And now notice that I've got my profile set to image P3. Among Apple products and other hardware out there, it's known as Display P3, same diff. But watch what happens. I want you to see how very, very intense all of these colors are. Watch those colors as I switch to the sRGB space. So I'm not converting, I'm just assigning a different color profile, and that means all the colors are changing. So this is P3, whether it's display P3 or image P3, doesn't matter. And this is the much smaller gamut sRGB space. Do you see how we're just like losing all kinds of vivid colors? And as a result, the colors are looking a lot more similar, the neighboring colors. Like for example, 355 to 0 to 5 don't look very different at all. 255 and 30, I would argue, look pretty similar. 55 and 60 look very, very similar indeed. That goes for 50 degrees as well. Whereas 325, 335, and 345 down here in the bottom right corner, they still look very different. So that is going to depend. How the HSB values translate to RGB is going to depend upon your profile, your RGB profile, which is actually a really great thing because that means you're trying to define colors independent of RGB, even though it's a loosey-goosey space. There, I said it 3 times now in this video. Anyway, I'm going to switch to a more common inside Photoshop space, which is Adobe RGB, and that is going to change the colors as well. Notice we're flattening those red values quite a bit, but we're seeing even more of a pronounced difference from 315, 325, 335, and 345 on the right end over here of the magenta bar. And so the magenta color swatches, that is. So you might want to play around with these. All you have to do is choose the Assign Profile command from the Edit menu and then try different profiles and see what you end up with. For the basically P3 is going to give you a really huge range. Another one to try out, it's going to be listed among these right here, but it's going to be the Pro Photo RGB space. Try that as well, and you'll see that the colors are very vivid indeed. So I just want to assure you that HSB does translate to different RGB values as well as different CMYK values depending on how your document is profiled. So what do you think? Comment below. Not to mention, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And don't forget, for the full uncut joy, join me at patreon.com/DeekNow. Then go to Deek.com and sign up for my newsletter. I'm Deek McClellan. This is Deek Now.